A 10-year-old girl reveals a shocking secret about her stepfather. Then, the father says he's going to work but stays hidden nearby to find out what was happening. What he saw the stepfather do to his daughter left him desperate. Christopher, a 39-year-old man, had been separated from his ex-wife Susan for over 3 years. His 10-year-old daughter Alice was acting increasingly strange each day, which made him suspect that something was wrong. She exhibited odd behavior every time she visited her father. He questioned his ex-wife about why their daughter was acting so strangely. She said she hadn't noticed anything unusual and claimed to know nothing. Christopher sat on his living room couch, legs stretched out on the coffee table, flipping through a magazine he had read dozens of times. But the pages didn't hold his attention. His mind was miles away, stuck on the last visit from his 10-year-old daughter, Alice. Ever since she had left, an uncomfortable feeling had been gnawing at him. Something wasn't right. He abruptly shut the magazine and tossed it aside. Alice had been acting strange, and he couldn't shake the thought. During her entire visit, she had barely spoken, hardly looked him in the eye, and every question he asked was met with short, one-word answers or nods. This wasn't like Alice at all. She used to be full of life, running to him with open arms, bombarding him with questions about his day. Now, she was distant, almost like a stranger. This isn't normal, he thought, biting the inside of his cheek. A tightness grew in his stomach, a mounting anxiety that had only worsened since she left. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room. He couldn't figure this out on his own. He needed answers. Reaching for the phone on the table, Christopher dialed Susan, his ex-wife. He knew this conversation wouldn't be pleasant, but that didn't matter anymore. Something was happening to their daughter, and he needed to know what it was. The phone rang a few times before Susan's voice came through the line, filled with the impatience he knew all too well. "Christopher, what is it?" she asked, bluntly. He took a deep breath before responding, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I need to talk about Alice," he said, keeping his tone steady but direct. "Have you noticed anything strange with her lately?" There was a brief pause. He could picture Susan on the other end, probably frowning, maybe even rolling her eyes. He knew those pauses well. "Strange?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disinterest. "No, nothing out of the ordinary." Christopher felt a surge of irritation rising inside him. How could she not notice? He clenched his eyes shut for a second, trying not to snap, but the frustration was already building. "What do you mean, Susan?" he replied, his voice firmer now. "Our daughter barely speaks to me. She's different, more withdrawn. She doesn't ask questions or smile like she used to. How can you not see that?" On the other side of the line, Susan let out an audible sigh, as if she were already tired of this conversation. "Christopher, you're overreacting," she said, her impatience now turning to condescension. "Alice is fine. If something was wrong, I'd know." That last sentence hit Christopher like a punch to the gut. A mix of anger and helplessness surged through him as he listened to the way Susan dismissed his concerns. She'd know? How could she know? Susan barely spent any real time with Alice. She was always busy with her own things, her new life with Ethan. She didn't see the changes, the small details. "I'm not overreacting, Susan," Christopher said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "I know our daughter. Something is wrong with her and you're not paying attention." A heavy silence filled the line. Christopher could hear Susan breathing, as if she were about to argue back, but nothing came. He waited, but when she finally did speak, her tone was cold, almost indifferent. "Christopher, I told you, Alice is fine. You're worrying over nothing. Let it go." And before he could protest, she added, "I have to go. Goodbye." She hung up. Christopher stared at the phone in his hand, disbelief washing over him. The sound of the deadline echoed in his ears like a warning. She wasn't taking this seriously. How could she not see it? Alice was different, more withdrawn, more isolated, and her mother didn't even care. That ate at him. He tossed the phone back onto the couch, running his hands through his hair, exasperated. What was he supposed to do now? Susan had made it clear she didn't care, or at the very least, she wasn't going to help. To her, everything was normal, and any concern he had was just paranoia. But Christopher knew better. He knew his daughter. Something was off. and if Susan wasn't going to help him figure it out, he would have to do it on his own. He sank back down onto the couch, his mind racing with thoughts. "This can't go on like this," he told himself, pressing his fingers to his temples. The weight of the situation bore down on him. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and he'd likely face more resistance from Susan and Ethan. But he couldn't ignore his gut. Alice needed him, even if she hadn't said the words. "I'll see this through," he decided, his resolve hardening. And with that, Christopher knew that this was just the first of many battles. With that certainty, Christopher stood up, a new fire burning in his chest. In the days following his frustrating conversation with Susan, Christopher's worry only deepened. He couldn't stop thinking about Alice. The image of his daughter, so different, so silent, haunted him. This wasn't just a normal shift in behavior. Something more serious was going on, something he couldn't quite grasp yet. And Susan's indifference wasn't helping. Christopher knew he had to dig deeper. His daughter was in danger. He could feel it. And he suspected the issue might be closer than Susan realized. Ethan, Susan's new husband, who had always unsettled Christopher in subtle ways, now seemed to be at the heart of the problem. Ethan had married Susan not long after the divorce, and from the start, Christopher had never fully trusted him. There was something off about him, the way he talked, the way he carried himself. Everything about Ethan felt calculated, as if he was always carefully choosing his words, measuring people's reactions. Christopher made a decision. He would confront Ethan. He would go straight to him and get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. Without wasting any more time, he drove to the house where Alice now lived with Susan and Ethan. Every mile he covered only tightened the knot in his chest. He knew the confrontation wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect his daughter. When he arrived, he parked in front of the house. The place he once shared with Susan now felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. He took a deep breath and marched to the door, ringing the bell with determination. It took only a few seconds for the door to open. There stood Ethan, leaning against the doorframe with a smug smile, his arms crossed as if he already knew why Christopher was there. "Christopher, what do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with disdain, making no effort to hide his annoyance. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes betrayed a sharp alertness, like he was ready for the confrontation he knew was coming. Christopher didn't waste any time. He wasn't here for games or small talk. "I want to know what's going on with my daughter," Christopher said, his voice firm and without hesitation. "Alice is different. Something is wrong, and you know it. What do you know?" Ethan tilted his head slightly and let out a short, dry laugh full of sarcasm. "This is all in your head," Ethan replied, the mockery clear in his tone. "Alice is perfectly fine. You're just imagining problems that aren't there." Ethan's laughter echoed in Christopher's mind like an insult. He felt the blood rush to his face, his anger rising. His skin burned with the heat of fury, but he knew he couldn't lose control. Not here, not now. Ethan was trying to provoke him, and Christopher wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Don't give me that!" Christopher snapped, his eyes narrowing as he fought to keep his voice steady, though every word was dripping with tension. "I know my daughter. I know when something's wrong. If you're doing something to her, I'll find out, and when I do, you'll regret it." Ethan slowly uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly, his expression shifting from smug to something more dangerous. He took a step toward Christopher, his face hardening. "I already told you," Ethan began, his voice low, almost a threatening whisper. "You're imagining things. Alice is fine. Stop looking for problems where there aren't any. She's just a kid going through normal stuff for her age." Christopher almost lost his temper as he listened to Ethan dismiss the situation again. The way Ethan spoke, so sure of himself, like he was some kind of protector, while Christopher was being irrational, only made his suspicions grow stronger. How could Ethan be so certain that Alice was okay when it was clear she wasn't? "You're not fooling anyone, Ethan," Christopher said, stepping forward, closing the gap between them. "I know you're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is. And if you're hurting my daughter in any way, you won't get away with it. I'll do whatever it takes to get you out of her life." Ethan stared back at him, his eyes locked on Christopher's, the silence between them thick with tension. He didn't flinch, but he didn't say anything more either. It was as if he was calculating his next move, weighing his words carefully, like a man playing a mental chess game. After several long seconds of stony silence, Ethan finally took a step back and smirked, that same smug smile that made Christopher's blood boil. "Do whatever you think you need to do, Christopher, but you'll see, you're overreacting. Alice is fine. And Susan is happy. I'm her husband now, and their life is with me. You'd better accept that." The anger in Christopher surged even more, but he knew there was no point in staying any longer. Ethan wasn't going to say anything useful. Christopher turned on his heel abruptly, without another word, and left the house, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step he took away from Ethan was a battle to keep his composure, but inside, his decision had already been made. Something was deeply wrong in that house, and he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. Ethan was hiding something. Christopher could feel it in his bones. And now, more than ever, he knew he needed help. As he walked away from Susan's house, Christopher got into his car, his chest still tight, but a new determination coursing through him. He already knew who to call next. When Christopher returned to his house, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The confrontation with Ethan had only solidified his suspicions, but now, more than ever, he needed guidance. There was only one person he trusted to understand the weight of his fears: his mother, Layla. Layla had always been his rock, the one who could see through every situation with sharp intuition and maternal wisdom. Christopher didn't waste any time. He sat down at the kitchen table, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed her number. The phone rang twice before Layla's familiar voice came through. "Christopher, is everything okay?" she asked, immediately sensing something was wrong. Christopher didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mom, something's very wrong with Alice," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "I've tried talking to Susan, but she acts like nothing's happening. She refuses to see it. And Ethan is hiding something, I'm sure of it. There's something dark going on in that house." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Christopher could almost hear the wheels turning in his mother's mind. When Layla finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm, each word measured and deliberate. "Christopher, listen to me carefully," she said, her tone filled with the seriousness of a mother who had seen too much in her lifetime. "I've had a bad feeling for a while now, the kind of feeling I've learned to trust. You're not imagining things. I can feel it in my bones. Something terrible is happening, and it involves Alice. You cannot let this go." Christopher swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach tightening as his mother's words sank in. Layla had always been perceptive, often seeing things that others couldn't. If she felt this strongly about the situation, it only confirmed what Christopher feared. "Mom, I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I tried confronting Ethan, but he brushed me off, made me feel like I was the one going crazy. And Susan, she's so wrapped up in her life with him, she won't even listen to me." Layla's voice softened, but her resolve was unwavering. "Christopher, this isn't about Susan or Ethan. It's about Alice. She's your daughter, and she needs you now more than ever. You're her father, and you have to protect her. Whatever Ethan is hiding, it's your job to find out, but you need to be smart about it. Don't confront him again without a plan. You need to gather evidence, something concrete, before you can take any real action." Christopher nodded to himself, knowing she was right. Running headfirst into another confrontation with Ethan wouldn't solve anything. He needed proof, something undeniable that would force Susan to see the truth, something that would ensure Alice's safety. "I'll figure it out," Christopher said, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "I just don't know where to start. I don't have anyone to help me, except you." Layla's voice was steady, her love for her son and granddaughter clear in every word. "You're not alone, Christopher. I'll do whatever it takes to help you, but you're going to need more than just me. You need someone who knows how to handle situations like this, someone who can investigate and get to the bottom of things without tipping anyone off." Christopher sat in silence for a moment, thinking. His mother was right. He needed someone with experience, someone who could look into Ethan without raising suspicions. And then it hit him. "Robert. There's someone," Christopher said slowly. "Robert, Dad's old friend, the retired cop. He was a detective for years. If anyone can help me figure this out, it's him. Layla's voice brightened with hope. That's it, Christopher. Call Robert. He'll know what to do. The decision made, Christopher felt a small wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in days, he felt like he was finally taking steps in the right direction. Thanks, Mom, he said, his voice softer now. I don't know what I'd do without you. Layla's gentle laughter came through the phone. You're a good father, Christopher. Just trust your instincts. Alice needs you to be strong now. With that, they ended the call. Christopher sat for a moment, staring at his phone, the enormity of what lay ahead weighing heavily on him. But now, at least, he had a plan. He had to reach out to Robert. It was the only way to get to the bottom of what Ethan was hiding and to protect his daughter. Without hesitating, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Robert's number. It had been a while since they'd spoken, but Robert was the kind of man who would drop everything for a friend. Taking a deep breath, Christopher pressed call, listening to the phone ring on the other end. After a few rings, a gruff, familiar voice answered. Chris, long time no hear. Robert's voice was warm, though tinged with curiosity. What's going on? Everything all right? Christopher wasted no time. Robert, I need your help. It's about Alice. I think something bad is happening and I can't figure it out alone. There was a brief pause on the other end as Robert processed the urgency in Christopher's tone. Then, his voice shifted, becoming more serious. Tell me everything. Christopher relayed the events of the past few days, the changes in Alice's behavior, Susan's denial, his confrontation with Ethan, and the growing sense that something was deeply wrong. As he spoke, Robert listened intently, occasionally muttering under his breath as if piecing together a puzzle. When Christopher finished, Robert let out a heavy sigh. This sounds bad, Chris. Real bad. I don't like the sound of Ethan at all, but we can't jump to conclusions just yet. If we're going to get to the truth, we need to be smart about this. That's what my mom said, Christopher replied. She thinks I need to be careful, gather evidence before making any accusations. She's right, Robert agreed. We need to approach this quietly. I've got a friend, Vanessa, still active in the force. She's sharp, smart, knows how to handle delicate situations like this. If anyone can help us figure out what's going on, it's her. I'll reach out to her, but we should probably meet in person tomorrow to go over everything. Sound good? Christopher nodded, already feeling a bit more in control now that Robert was involved. Yeah, that sounds good. I'll meet you in the morning. As Christopher hung up the phone, the tension in his chest eased slightly. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He had his mother's unwavering support, and now Robert was on board, ready to help him uncover the truth. He still didn't know exactly what Ethan was hiding, but with Robert's experience and connections, Christopher felt a renewed sense of hope that they'd find out soon. But even as he prepared for the next steps, the nagging fear for Alice's safety remained. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Christopher felt the weight of his growing anxiety pressed down harder than ever. His mother had been clear. He needed to be careful, strategic, and above all, smart. But he was just a father worried about his daughter. He wasn't equipped to handle something like this. There was only one person he could think of who might know what to do, Robert. Robert had been a close friend of Christopher's late father, a man of few words but sharp instincts. As a retired detective, Robert had spent years navigating the murky waters of crime and deceit. Christopher didn't hesitate any longer. He picked up his phone and dialed Robert's number, hoping that his old family friend could guide him through this nightmare. The phone rang a few times before a deep, familiar voice came on the line. Chris, what's going on? Robert's voice was warm but laced with curiosity. They hadn't spoken in a while, and he could sense something was wrong. Robert, I need your help. Christopher's voice trembled slightly, the stress of the past days evident. It's about Alice. I think something terrible is happening with her, but I don't know where to start. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of Robert shifting in his chair. Tell me everything, Robert said, his tone shifting to the calm, professional demeanor of a man who had heard far too many bad stories in his life. Christopher took a deep breath and began to recount everything. He told Robert about Alice's sudden change in behavior, Susan's refusal to acknowledge the problem, and most importantly, his confrontation with Ethan. He didn't hold back on his suspicions about Ethan, how the man had dodged his questions, acted dismissive, and left him feeling more certain than ever that he was hiding something. Robert remained silent as Christopher spoke, only offering the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. When Christopher finally finished, there was a long silence on the line. Christopher held his breath, waiting for Robert's response. "Chris, this sounds bad. Really bad," Robert said finally, his voice serious. "I don't like any of what I'm hearing about Ethan, but you can't go charging in again without a plan. If he's hiding something, we need to figure out what it is, and we need to do it carefully. You can't afford to mess this up." Christopher nodded, even though Robert couldn't see him. He knew his old friend was right. He had to be smart about this if he wanted to protect Alice. "So, what do I do?" Christopher asked, feeling the helplessness wash over him again. "First, you stop acting alone," Robert replied, his voice firm but reassuring. "We're going to get some help. I've got a friend on the force, Vanessa. She's sharp, knows how to dig into situations like this without raising alarms. I'll talk to her tonight, but we'll need to meet tomorrow to go over everything and make a plan." Christopher felt a wave of relief. Finally, he wasn't alone. Robert's calm, methodical approach was exactly what he needed. "Thanks, Robert. I don't know what I would have done without you," Christopher said, his voice softer now. "Don't worry about it," Robert replied. "I knew your dad well, and I know you. We're going to get to the bottom of this, but until we meet, stay close to Alice. Don't confront Ethan again, not without a plan." "I won't," Christopher promised. They agreed to meet at Christopher's office the next morning. After hanging up the phone, Christopher sat back and let out a long sigh. It felt good to have someone like Robert on his side, someone with experience and a plan. But even with that relief, a knot of fear still sat heavy in his chest. This was far from over. The next morning, Christopher arrived early at his office. He paced the room, thinking over everything he'd told Robert. A part of him dreaded hearing what Vanessa would have to say. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would tell him he was wrong, that he was overreacting, that Alice's behavior was just a phase. But deep down, he knew the truth. Ethan was involved in something, and whatever it was hurting his daughter. Soon after, there was a knock on the door. Christopher opened it to find Robert, dressed in his usual casual attire, with the same no-nonsense look on his face. Behind him stood a woman Christopher had never met but immediately recognized as Vanessa. She was sharp-looking, with a focused, professional demeanor that told him she was someone who got things done. "Chris, this is Vanessa," Robert introduced, gesturing toward her. "She's been in the force for over 15 years and specializes in domestic cases like these." Vanessa stepped forward and shook Christopher's hand. "Nice to meet you," she said, her tone polite but direct. "Robert's told me a bit about what's going on, but I'd like to hear everything from you." Christopher gestured for them to sit down, and he quickly launched into the story again. This time, he didn't leave anything out. The details of Alice's odd behavior, Susan's refusal to acknowledge it, and the gut feeling that had been gnawing at him ever since. He described his confrontation with Ethan, every word, every expression, how Ethan had laughed off his concerns. Vanessa listened intently, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp, assessing every detail. "Ethan didn't give you any solid answers," Vanessa said, more as a statement than a question. "No," Christopher replied, frustration creeping into his voice. "He treated me like I was imagining things. But I'm not. I know Alice. Something's wrong, and it's got to do with him." Vanessa nodded slowly, then looked at Robert. "We can't make any moves without concrete evidence," she said, turning back to Christopher. "But I believe you. Kids don't change that drastically without a reason. If Ethan's involved in something harmful, we need to find out what it is before we act. Otherwise, he could manipulate the situation to his advantage, and that would make it even harder for you to protect Alice." Christopher's heart sank a little. He wanted action now, not later. But he knew she was right. Charging in without proof would only backfire. "So what's the plan?" Christopher asked, his voice a mix of urgency and frustration. Vanessa leaned forward, folding her hands together. "First, we need to start watching him closely. We'll need to gather evidence. If he's doing something to Alice or hiding something illegal, we'll find it, but we have to do this quietly. He can't know we're onto him." "How do we do that?" Christopher asked. "Leave that to me," Vanessa said. "I've handled cases like this before. I'll start digging into Ethan's background, checking for any red flags. In the meantime, Robert will help you keep an eye on Alice. Watch for any signs of what might be happening inside the house. If we can pinpoint any behavior or pattern, it'll help." Christopher felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. These two knew what they were doing, and for the first time in days, he felt like he had a real chance at getting to the truth. "I'll do whatever it takes," Christopher said. "I just want my daughter safe." Vanessa nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We'll keep her safe, Christopher. But you have to trust us. This will take time, but we'll get there." Robert stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "All right, we've got work to do," he said. "Vanessa will handle the investigation. I'll keep in close contact with you. In the meantime, don't let Ethan know we're on to him. Act like nothing's changed." Christopher stood as well, shaking both their hands. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you for this." "Don't worry about it," Robert said, clapping Christopher on the shoulder. "We're not doing this for thanks. We're doing it for Alice." With that, they left, and Christopher was alone in his office, a heavy mixture of relief and fear swirling inside him. They had a plan now, but the hardest part was yet to come. He had to act normal around Ethan, keep Susan in the dark, and above all, protect Alice until they could expose whatever dark secret was hidden in that house. And now, the waiting began. After the intense meeting in his office, Christopher sat back, digesting everything Vanessa and Robert had shared with him. The reality of the situation was sobering. Vanessa, with her expertise, was direct as she laid out the limitations they faced. "Christopher," Vanessa said, her voice steady but firm, "without a court order, we can't investigate Ethan officially. We need something solid to take to the authorities. But you, as her father, have the best access to Alice. You'll be the first to notice if anything is wrong. For now, you need to observe closely. Keep your eyes open and stay patient." Christopher absorbed her words. The idea of simply watching, waiting, and doing nothing more immediate gnawed at him. Every instinct he had screamed to act to protect his daughter now. But he understood the strategy. If they moved too quickly, they risked tipping Ethan off, and that could make things even worse for Alice. It was a frustrating position to be in, but he didn't have a choice. "I'll do it," Christopher finally said, his voice low but determined. "I'll keep an eye on her. I'll find out what's going on." Vanessa gave him a nod of approval, but her face remained serious. "You'll need to play this smart. If Ethan senses anything, he might become more careful, or worse, more dangerous. Don't give him a reason to suspect that we're onto him." Christopher nodded, though the weight of her warning hung over him like a dark cloud. He had to be careful, not just for himself but for Alice. He couldn't afford any missteps. That evening, after Robert and Vanessa left, Christopher made his first move. He picked up the phone and dialed Susan's number, already anticipating the conversation. She answered after a few rings, her tone as brisk and distant as always. "Christopher, what's up?" He steadied his voice, knowing he couldn't show any sign of the tension he was feeling. "I was thinking I could pick Alice up from school tomorrow," he suggested, keeping his tone casual. "I haven't had much time with her lately, and I thought it'd be nice to spend some time together. I'll drop her back at your place after." There was a brief pause, and Christopher could hear Susan's exasperated sigh. "Yeah, sure, that's fine. I've got a hair appointment anyway, so it works out for me." Christopher felt a surge of anger at her indifference. Alice was their daughter, yet Susan treated her like a task to be managed, something to be offloaded when it was convenient. He clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to say something harsh. Now wasn't the time. "Great," he said simply, forcing a calm tone. "I'll pick her up after school." Susan didn't offer much more than a quick goodbye before hanging up, leaving Christopher staring at his phone. He had always known that Susan was more focused on herself than their daughter, but each interaction with her only reinforced how little she truly understood about Alice or cared to understand. The next day arrived quickly, and Christopher found himself parked outside Alice's school, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the kids pour out of the building. When Alice finally appeared, her small figure moving among the other children, he felt both relief and anxiety. She looked so quiet, so closed off. The energetic, curious girl he once knew seemed buried under a weight he couldn't yet see. "Hey, Alice!" Christopher called out as she approached the car. She gave him a small smile, but it was faint, almost like a reflex. There was no joy behind it, no real connection. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, her head down, and buckled her seatbelt. Christopher glanced at her, trying to gauge how to start the conversation. He couldn't come on too strong. Vanessa's advice echoed in his mind. Watch, observe, and don't push too hard. He needed Alice to feel safe, to know that she could talk to him. "So how was school?" he asked lightly, pulling away from the curb. "It was fine," Alice replied, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes staring out the window. Christopher pressed his lips together. She used to talk non-stop about her day, every detail spilling out of her like a burst of excitement. But now it was like she was hiding behind a wall, unreachable. They drove in silence for a while, the tension between them thick but unspoken. Christopher's mind raced, searching for a way to reach her. He didn't want to scare her or make her uncomfortable, but he needed answers. "Alice," he began softly, "I've noticed you've been a little quiet lately. You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." For a moment, Alice didn't respond. She just kept staring out the window, her hands gripping the edge of her backpack tightly. But then, slowly, she turned her head to look at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, fear, sadness, maybe both. "I don't want to talk about it, Dad," she said quietly, her voice shaky. Christopher felt a stab of pain in his chest at her words. The way she avoided his gaze, the way her voice trembled, it was confirmation that something was terribly wrong. He fought to keep his voice steady, knowing he couldn't push too hard. "Okay," he said gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but just know, whenever you're ready, I'm here. I'll always be here for you." Alice nodded, but she didn't say anything more. The rest of the drive was quiet, the silence thick with unspoken words. Christopher's mind raced, trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't force Alice to open up, but now he was more certain than ever that something was going on in that house. And if Ethan was the cause, Christopher needed to know exactly what he was doing to his daughter. When they arrived at Susan's house, Christopher parked the car and turned to Alice, giving her a soft smile. "I'll see you soon, okay?" he said, reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. Alice nodded again, her movements slow, almost mechanical. As she got out of the car and walked up the driveway, Christopher's eyes followed her every step, his heart heavy. She seemed so small, so fragile, and he hated that she was walking back into that house, back to whatever was happening behind those closed doors. Once Alice disappeared inside, Christopher pulled away from the curb but didn't drive off. Instead, he parked a little further down the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He couldn't just leave. Not yet. Something inside him told him to stay, to watch, just in case. He glanced at the house, watching from a distance. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn, giving no hint of what was happening inside. He waited, his mind racing, trying to piece together any clue that might help him figure out what Ethan was hiding. After a few minutes, his patience was rewarded. The front door opened, and Ethan stepped out. Christopher's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he watched the man he suspected was hurting his daughter. Ethan looked around, scanning the street as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Christopher ducked down slightly, hoping not to be seen. Ethan walked to the side of the house, his posture relaxed, almost casual, but Christopher could see through it. There was something calculated about his movements, as if he was performing for someone. After a moment, Ethan pulled out his phone, speaking to someone Christopher couldn't hear. His body language was different now, tense, defensive. Whatever Ethan was hiding, it was more than just his bad attitude. Christopher's mind raced. He needed to know who Ethan was talking to and why he was acting so secretive. But this wasn't the time to confront him, not without more information. He'd promised Vanessa and Robert he wouldn't act impulsively. As Ethan disappeared back into the house, Christopher's heart pounded with a renewed sense of urgency. He had to protect Alice. He was getting closer to the truth. He could feel it. And now, he just needed proof. The next afternoon, Christopher parked outside Alice's school, waiting for her to emerge from the crowd of children streaming through the front doors. As soon as he saw her, his heart sank. Alice looked small, withdrawn, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world rested on them. Her backpack dangled loosely, almost slipping off her thin frame. She opened the car door without saying a word, slid into the passenger seat, and closed the door quietly. Christopher watched her carefully, hoping for any sign that she might be willing to talk. But Alice didn't even glance in his direction. Her gaze remained fixed out the window, distant and empty. Christopher started the car and pulled away from the school, the silence between them thick and heavy. He glanced over at her, trying to figure out where to begin. Her behavior was getting worse, more withdrawn, more distant, and each time he saw her, she seemed further away. "Alice," Christopher began gently, keeping his voice calm despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "What's going on, sweetheart? Why are you so sad?" For a moment, it seemed like Alice didn't hear him. She sat still, her hands tightly gripping the bottom of her skirt, twisting the fabric anxiously. Christopher waited, hoping she would respond. But the longer the silence stretched, the more his heart pounded. He wanted to reach out, shake her, make her tell him what was happening, but he knew he couldn't push her like that. He had to be patient, even if it was killing him inside. Finally, Alice spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to talk about it, Daddy." Christopher's heart twisted at her words. There was something in her voice, a fragility, a deep sadness, that made him want to pull the car over, take her in his arms, and promise that everything would be okay. But he didn't know if he could promise that. Not yet. "Okay," he said softly, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You don't have to talk about it right now, but you know you can tell me anything, right? I'm here for you, no matter what." Alice didn't respond. She kept staring out the window, her face unreadable, her eyes filled with a sadness far too heavy for a child to carry. Christopher clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he fought the urge to demand answers. He knew better. Pushing her wouldn't help. But every second of silence was tearing him apart. The rest of the drive was quiet. Alice didn't say a word, and Christopher didn't push any further. He couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her head. Why wouldn't she talk to him? Was she scared? Confused? Whatever it was, Ethan had to be at the center of it. Christopher was sure of that now. The fear in Alice's eyes, the way she recoiled from certain questions, it all pointed to something happening at home, something she didn't feel safe enough to share. When they arrived back at Susan's house, Christopher parked the car and turned to Alice. He wanted to say something, anything that might reach her, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he promise to protect her if he didn't even know what was happening? "I'll be here, Alice, whenever you're ready," he said finally, his voice tight with emotion. "You can always talk to me." Alice nodded slightly but didn't look at him. She unbuckled her seatbelt, grabbed her backpack, and opened the door. Christopher watched as she walked up the driveway, her steps slow, as if she were walking towards something she dreaded. Before she disappeared inside, Alice paused and glanced back at Christopher, just for a moment. Their eyes met, and in that brief second, he saw it, the fear, the pain, the desperation in her gaze. She looked like she wanted to say something, like the words were on the tip of her tongue, but then, just as quickly, she turned away and went inside. Christopher sat in the car, his heart racing. He knew that look. It was a silent cry for help, a signal that something was deeply, terribly wrong. And now, more than ever, he knew he couldn't wait much longer. He needed to act. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Robert. "How did it go? Did she say anything?" Christopher stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back quickly. "No, she's shutting me out. But something is definitely wrong. I'm sure of it now." There was a brief pause before Robert replied. "We need to escalate this. Let's talk tonight. Vanessa will know what to do." Christopher leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He didn't want to involve Alice in something bigger than she could handle, but he had no choice. Whatever Ethan was doing, whether it was psychological, emotional, or even worse, he couldn't let it continue. As he drove away from Susan's house, Christopher felt a deep sense of dread settle over him. The image of Alice's fearful eyes lingered in his mind, haunting him. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. He thought about everything that had happened in the past few days, about Ethan's smug behavior, Susan's indifference, and Alice's growing silence. Whatever was happening in that house, it was poisoning his daughter, and he was running out of time to save her. By the time he got home, Christopher had made up his mind. He couldn't wait any longer. He had been patient, just like Vanessa and Robert had advised, but Alice's silence was more than just fear. It was a warning. Something had to be done. He grabbed his phone and dialed Robert's number. It rang twice before the familiar voice answered. "Chris, I was just about to call you," Robert said. "Vanessa's ready to move forward with the next steps, but we need to talk." "Robert, I can't wait anymore," Christopher interrupted, his voice trembling with urgency. "I saw it in her eyes today. She's terrified. Whatever Ethan is doing, it's hurting her. I need to act now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Robert knew how hard this was for Christopher, and he didn't want to hold him back. But they still needed to be careful. "I understand," Robert said finally. "We'll move forward. Let's meet tonight and discuss how we're going to do this. Vanessa has some ideas. We need to gather solid evidence before confronting Ethan or going to the authorities." Christopher took a deep breath. He knew Robert was right. Rushing in without a plan could make things worse. But the image of Alice's sad, distant face was burned into his mind. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll meet you tonight. But we can't wait much longer, Robert. I won't let her go back into that house for another day if we don't have a plan." "I'll make sure we move fast," Robert promised. After hanging up, Christopher stood in the middle of his living room, the weight of his next steps pressing down on him. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. Tonight they would plan, and soon he would have the evidence he needed to bring Alice back home, away from Ethan, away from whatever darkness was lurking in that house. He had made a promise to his daughter. Now it was time to fulfill it. Christopher had been driving Alice home, the tension between them palpable, when he decided to take a risk. He knew he had to tread carefully. Every interaction with Alice lately had been delicate, as if he were walking on glass. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense that time was running out. "Alice," he began softly, glancing over at her, who sat hunched in the passenger seat. "I've been really worried about you. You've been so quiet, so different. Is everything okay with Ethan?" There was no immediate response. Alice didn't even flinch. She sat motionless, staring straight ahead, her small hands gripping her backpack tightly. Christopher's heart sank. He knew this reaction all too well by now, the silence, the avoidance. But this time, he couldn't back down. He had to ask the hard questions, even if it hurt. "Sweetheart, if Ethan's bothering you or doing anything that makes you uncomfortable, you can tell me. You know that, right?" Christopher's voice trembled slightly, the fear of hearing the worst gnawing at him. Alice shifted in her seat, her fingers twisting the straps of her bag nervously. She didn't turn to look at him, didn't speak. Instead, her head dropped, her eyes fixed on her lap. Christopher kept driving, his heart pounding, waiting for any kind of response. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Just as he was about to say something else, he saw it, a single tear sliding down Alice's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, as if trying to hide it, but it was too late. Christopher had seen it, and that tear told him more than words ever could. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white with the force of his grip. That one tear shattered whatever denial he had been clinging to. His suspicions about Ethan, the unease that had been festering for weeks, it all came crashing down at that moment. Something was happening to Alice, and it involved Ethan. There was no more doubt in Christopher's mind. "Alice," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you don't have to hide anything from me. I'm here to protect you. No matter what's happening, I promise you, I'll make sure you're safe." But Alice said nothing. She remained silent, her body curled up defensively, her face turned toward the window. Christopher's heart broke watching her like that. His little girl, so full of life just a few months ago, now seemed to be shrinking before his eyes. He wanted to reach over, to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay. But he knew that promises meant little if he couldn't act on them. Christopher's mind was racing. He couldn't just sit back and let this continue. He had to get her out of that house, away from Ethan. But how? He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Ethan was careful, calculating, and if he even suspected Christopher was onto him, things could escalate in dangerous ways. Alice was already terrified. The last thing Christopher wanted was to make it worse for her. As they pulled up to Susan's house, Christopher parked the car, but didn't turn off the engine. He stared at the house, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't just about him and Susan's failed marriage anymore. This wasn't about the messy custody battle or his feelings of resentment toward Ethan. This was about Alice, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. "Alice," he said again, more softly this time. She finally looked at him, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Do you understand?" Alice nodded, but it was weak, almost imperceptible. She wiped another tear from her cheek, still refusing to say anything. Christopher took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. The rage he felt toward Ethan was boiling just beneath the surface, but he couldn't let it show. Not here, not now. He had to be smart, just like Robert and Vanessa had warned him. If he acted impulsively, he could make things worse, not just for him, but for Alice. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" Christopher said, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "And if you need anything at all, you call me, day or night. Promise?" Alice hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. She grabbed her backpack and opened the door slowly, as if she were reluctant to leave the car. Christopher watched as she walked toward the house, her small figure disappearing through the front door. He wanted to follow her, to drag her out of there and take her somewhere safe, somewhere far away from Ethan. But he knew that wouldn't help. Not yet. He stayed in the car, his eyes fixed on the house, waiting. For what, he wasn't sure. Maybe he hoped to see some sign, some confirmation of what he already feared. Maybe he just needed a moment to gather his thoughts before driving away. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. The house remained still, silent, hiding its secrets behind closed doors. Christopher's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Robert. "We need to talk. Vanessa's in. Let's meet tonight." Christopher stared at the message, his heart pounding. This was it. They were moving forward. Vanessa had a plan, and they were ready to put it into action. He had to do whatever it took to get Alice out of that house. And now, with Robert and Vanessa's help, he had a chance. He took one last look at Susan's house before pulling away from the curb. The anger inside him was growing, but so was his resolve. He wouldn't let Ethan get away with whatever he was doing to Alice. He couldn't. As he drove, Christopher's mind raced through all the possibilities. What was Ethan doing to her? Was it physical? Emotional? Both? The thought of any harm coming to his daughter made his blood boil. But he knew he couldn't afford to act out of rage. He had to be methodical, careful. Vanessa's involvement meant they had a shot at gathering the evidence they needed, but it would take time and patience. Patience was something Christopher was running out of. Every moment that Alice was in that house, he felt the weight of his failure to protect her. But he reminded himself that this was the only way to ensure her safety in the long run. They had to be strategic. If they moved too fast, Ethan could manipulate the situation, or worse, escalate his abuse. Christopher's phone buzzed again. It was another message from Robert. "Don't worry, Chris. We've got this. Tonight, we'll figure it all out." Christopher gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. He didn't respond to the text. There was nothing more to say. All that mattered now was action. As he pulled into his driveway, he realized that tonight could change everything. Whatever Vanessa had in mind, whatever plan they would put into place, this was their best shot at getting the truth. He parked the car and sat for a moment, staring straight ahead. Alice's tear-filled eyes haunted him. He could still see her sitting in the passenger seat, trying to be brave, trying to hide her pain. That single tear had been enough. It was all the proof he needed. Christopher knew that whatever it took, no matter how long it would take, he would make sure that Ethan paid for what he had done. More importantly, he would make sure Alice was never hurt again. He stepped out of the car, the weight of the coming night heavy on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. The pieces were falling into place, and soon Ethan's secrets would be exposed. And when that happened, Christopher would be ready. Tonight, they would plan. Tomorrow, they would act. After dropping Alice off at Susan's house, Christopher couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something gnawing at him, an instinct telling him that tonight might reveal something crucial. Instead of driving away, he parked further down the street, got out of the car, and found a spot where he could remain hidden but still watch the house. Crouching behind a tree in the front yard, Christopher kept his eyes locked on the house, every muscle tense, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The house was quiet, its exterior giving no hint of the tension that lurked within. But then the front door creaked open. Christopher squinted, expecting to see Ethan, or maybe even Susan, but instead, a woman appeared, someone he had never seen before. She was tall, wearing a long coat that seemed out of place given the setting. Her movements were quick, purposeful, as if she didn't want to be seen. Christopher's heart raced as he watched her glance around cautiously before stepping out and walking briskly down the street. "Who the hell is that?" Christopher muttered to himself, his mind racing. He had never seen this woman around before, and yet, there she was, slipping out of his ex-wife's house like she had something to hide. Christopher felt a surge of adrenaline. His instincts were screaming at him. Something was definitely wrong. This woman wasn't just a visitor. She had the air of someone involved in something secretive, something dangerous. Was she connected to Ethan? And if so, what did that mean for Alice? He watched her until she disappeared around the corner, then turned his attention back to the house. As if on cue, Ethan appeared in the living room, pacing back and forth. Christopher's pulse quickened. Through the window, he saw Alice standing in the hallway, just outside the living room, watching Ethan cautiously. Then it happened. Ethan stormed toward Alice, his posture aggressive. Christopher could see it in his body language, the way he loomed over her, how his face twisted in anger. He couldn't hear their conversation from his hiding spot, but he could see enough to know that Ethan was threatening her. Alice, standing small and fragile in front of him, flinched as he spoke. Christopher's blood boiled. He clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. His whole body screamed at him to run inside, to rip Ethan away from Alice and end this nightmare once and for all. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to stay smart, had to stick to the plan, or everything could blow up in his face. If he acted impulsively, he might lose his chance to get Alice out of that house permanently. But it took everything he had to stay where he was. Watching Ethan intimidate his daughter filled Christopher with a kind of rage he had never known before. Through the window, Ethan's mouth moved, and even though Christopher couldn't hear the words, he knew they were venomous. He saw Alice's body shrink further, her head lowering as if she was trying to make herself as small as possible. Ethan's finger jabbed toward her face, his whole body radiating anger. Christopher's nails dug into his palms. His mind raced with possibilities. What could Ethan possibly be saying to her? What kind of threats was he using to keep her silent? At that moment, Christopher knew that this wasn't just a bad stepfather-daughter relationship. Ethan wasn't just a controlling figure. He was dangerous, and Alice was suffering because of it. Christopher couldn't let this go on any longer. Suddenly, Ethan turned his head, as if sensing something, and Christopher ducked further behind the tree. His heart pounded in his chest, each thump louder than the last. He couldn't be seen. Not yet. Ethan glanced toward the front door, then back to Alice. The tension in the room was thick, even from where Christopher was watching. It was clear that Ethan wasn't finished with her, not by a long shot. Christopher had to bite down hard on his lip to stop himself from charging in there, fists ready. But he knew this wasn't the time. Ethan finally stepped back, his body still tense, but it seemed like the confrontation was over, for now. Alice, pale and shaken, retreated further into the hallway, her small frame trembling. Ethan turned away from her and stormed out of the room, disappearing deeper into the house. Christopher's heart ached as he watched Alice alone in the hallway, wiping tears from her eyes. He wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be all right, but he knew it would mean nothing unless he acted. He had to bring this to an end, and fast. He stayed hidden for another minute, making sure Ethan was gone before he moved from his spot. Christopher's hands shook with adrenaline as he took one last look at the house before creeping back to his car. His mind raced with questions about the mysterious woman who had left the house. Who was she? And why was Ethan so on edge after she left? Christopher drove away, his mind buzzing with thoughts of what he had just witnessed. The image of Ethan towering over Alice, his threats unmistakable, was burned into his brain. Whatever Ethan was hiding, it was bigger than Christopher had first thought. The involvement of this unknown woman only deepened the mystery. He needed answers, and now, more than ever, he needed Robert and Vanessa to act fast. That night, back at his office, Christopher sat down at his desk, waiting for Robert and Vanessa to arrive. His fingers drummed impatiently on the desk. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The unknown woman, Ethan's rage, Alice's fear. Every detail felt like a piece of a larger puzzle he couldn't yet see fully. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Robert entered first, his expression grim, followed closely by Vanessa, who had an air of quiet determination. "All right, Chris, what did you see?" Robert asked, taking a seat across from him. Vanessa remained standing, her sharp eyes watching Christopher closely, as if she was already piecing together his report before he even spoke. Christopher took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "It's worse than I thought," he began. "After I dropped Alice off, I hid outside. A woman I've never seen before left the house. She was acting strange, like she didn't want to be seen." Vanessa's brow furrowed at this, and she exchanged a glance with Robert. "Did you get a good look at her?" Vanessa asked, her tone sharp and professional. "Tall, dark coat, brown hair. I've never seen her around before," Christopher said, shaking his head. "But that's not all. After she left, I saw Ethan. He cornered Alice in the living room. He was threatening her, Vanessa. I couldn't hear what he said, but his body language." Christopher's voice cracked slightly, the frustration and anger breaking through. "He's hurting her, maybe not physically, but he's breaking her down. I can see it. I've never seen her so scared." Vanessa nodded, her face hardening. "This confirms what we've suspected. Ethan is definitely hiding something, and now we know it involves someone else." Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This woman could be the key. We need to find out who she is, and what her connection to Ethan is." "But how?" Christopher asked, his voice laced with urgency. "I can't just sit back and watch while Alice is in that house with him." Vanessa placed a hand on Christopher's arm, her gaze steady. "We'll get her out, but we need to move carefully. If we act too soon, we'll lose our chance to build a case strong enough to protect Alice permanently." Robert leaned back, thinking, "Vanessa's right. We need to dig into this woman's identity. Once we know who she is, we might be able to unravel Ethan's secrets." Vanessa nodded in agreement. "We'll start investigating her immediately. But in the meantime, Christopher, keep doing what you're doing. Stay close to Alice. Watch for any more signs." Christopher's heart pounded in his chest, but he nodded. It wasn't enough for him. It never felt like enough when his daughter's safety was on the line. But this was the only way. They had to be patient. But patience was running thin. Christopher crouched low as he made his way to the side of the house, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His breath was shallow, each step measured, every movement calculated to avoid detection. He wasn't supposed to be there. He knew that. But something inside him wouldn't let him leave. After seeing the mysterious woman leave the house and watching Ethan's aggressive behavior toward Alice, he had to know more. He had to understand what was happening inside those walls. And so, he found himself sneaking closer to the window, desperate for any piece of information that could confirm his suspicions. As he approached, he heard muffled voices. He flattened himself against the wall, his heart racing, and peered through the edge of the living room window. Inside, Ethan stood over Alice, towering above her like a dark shadow. She was frozen, her back against the wall, her face pale and filled with fear. Christopher's stomach churned at the sight. Then he heard Ethan's voice, low, threatening, dripping with malice. "Don't tell your mother anything, you hear me? Or you'll regret it, you little pest." The words hit Christopher like a sledgehammer. His entire body went rigid as the meaning of Ethan's threat sank in. Ethan wasn't just an arrogant bully or a bad stepfather. He was dangerous. He was actively threatening Alice, manipulating her into silence, and God only knew what else he was doing behind closed doors. Christopher's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to burst through the door, to grab Alice and pull her out of there, to confront Ethan and make him pay for everything he'd done. But he couldn't. Not yet. If he acted now without proof, Ethan would twist the situation. Susan, in her blind loyalty to Ethan, might even side with him. The courts would demand solid evidence to remove Alice from that house, and without it, Christopher's actions would only backfire, leaving Alice more vulnerable than ever. Still, standing there, listening to Ethan intimidate his daughter, it took every ounce of willpower Christopher had to stay still. He pressed closer to the window, his eyes never leaving Alice. She was trembling slightly, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt as if trying to steady herself. Her silence, her inability to speak up, spoke volumes. She was terrified, and it was Ethan who had made her this way. "I don't want to hear any more about it," Ethan continued, his voice still low but sharp. "You keep your mouth shut, or you'll regret it." Alice nodded quickly, her eyes wide and filled with tears. Christopher felt his heart shatter in that moment. His little girl, who once was so full of life and joy, was now reduced to this, a frightened child, forced to endure the threats of a man who should have been nowhere near her. Ethan, apparently satisfied with Alice's submission, turned his back on her and stormed out of the room, leaving her standing there, shaking. Christopher stayed hidden, his entire body tense with anger and helplessness. He watched as Alice slowly slid down the wall, sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She wiped her face quickly, trying to stop the tears, as if even her sadness had become something she needed to hide. Christopher's mind raced. He needed to act, but he had to be smart. He needed more than just the word of a frightened child. Vanessa and Robert were right. They needed undeniable evidence. But how? How could he gather enough proof without putting Alice in more danger? He thought about the mysterious woman he had seen earlier. Who was she? What role did she play in all of this? If she was involved with Ethan, then maybe she held the key to uncovering his secrets. If they could find out more about her, maybe they could unravel whatever Ethan was hiding, and that might give them the leverage they needed to rescue Alice from this nightmare. Christopher carefully stepped back from the window, retreating the way he had come, his mind already racing with the next steps. He couldn't confront Ethan directly, not yet. But there were other ways to get what he needed. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he quickly dialed Robert's number. It rang twice before Robert answered. "Chris, what's going on?" Christopher's voice was low, barely contained rage threading through each word. "I just heard Ethan threaten Alice. He told her not to say anything, or she'd regret it. He's scaring her into silence, Robert." There was a brief pause on the other end before Robert spoke, his voice calm but serious. "We knew he was dangerous, Chris, but we need more than just threats. We need to prove it, recordings, witnesses, something solid." "I know," Christopher muttered, trying to steady his breathing. "But I can't stand by and do nothing. I saw a woman leave the house earlier, someone I've never seen before. She was acting strange, like she didn't want to be noticed. I think she's connected to all of this. We need to find out who she is." Robert's tone sharpened, the detective in him kicking into gear. "All right, I'll look into her. If she's connected to Ethan, she might be the missing piece we need. But Chris, you need to stay calm. Don't do anything that'll put Alice in more danger. Let Vanessa and I handle the investigation. We'll get you what you need, but it's going to take time." Time. Christopher hated that word. Every second Alice spent in that house felt like an eternity to him, but he knew Robert was right. Rushing into this without a solid plan would only make things worse. He had to be patient, no matter how much it killed him inside. "I understand," Christopher finally said, his voice tight. "But we need to move fast. Alice is terrified, Robert. I don't know how much longer she can hold on." "We'll move as fast as we can," Robert reassured him. "Vanessa is already digging into Ethan's background, and I'll start tracking down this woman. In the meantime, you stay close to Alice. Keep an eye on her, But don't let Ethan know you're onto him." Christopher hung up, his mind spinning with everything he had just witnessed. He couldn't believe how far things had gone. Ethan wasn't just a bully, he was a manipulator, someone who thrived on control and fear. And now, more than ever, Christopher knew that if they didn't act quickly, Ethan's grip on Alice would only tighten. As he drove away from the house, the anger inside him simmered, but he forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't afford to lose control, not when Alice's safety was on the line. Back at home, Christopher sat in the darkened kitchen, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his mind. Ethan's threats, Alice's tear-filled eyes, the mysterious woman, it all added up to something dark and dangerous, something that went beyond just a strained stepfather-daughter relationship. But now, with Robert and Vanessa working behind the scenes, there was hope. Hope that they could gather the evidence they needed to take Ethan down once and for all. Hope that Alice could finally be free from the nightmare she was living in. Christopher took a deep breath, steadying himself. Tomorrow, they would move forward. Tomorrow, they would begin putting the pieces together. And soon, very soon, they would have enough to expose Ethan for what he truly was. But tonight, as he sat in the stillness of his home, Christopher couldn't shake the image of Alice, curled up against the wall, trying to hold back her tears. He wouldn't fail her. He couldn't. The decision to stay hidden had been agonizing. Every fiber of Christopher's being screamed at him to intervene, to protect Alice from Ethan's vicious threats. But now, after what he had witnessed through the window, the sneering, the intimidation, he could no longer hold back. His fists were clenched, and his breath came in short, furious bursts. His rational side warned him to wait, to stick to the plan, but his heart overpowered his mind. Christopher didn't knock. He didn't even hesitate. He stormed into the house, the door slamming against the wall as it flew open. The sound startled Ethan and Alice, both turning to see Christopher standing in the doorway, his eyes blazing with anger. Alice looked terrified, but Ethan's face twisted into a smug, mocking smirk. That smirk was all it took. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice dripping with disdain as he turned to face Christopher fully. Christopher didn't answer. His body moved on instinct, closing the distance between him and Ethan in an instant. His chest heaved as he stood mere inches away, the tension in the room crackling like electricity. "What do you think you're doing to my daughter?" Christopher's voice was loud, almost shaking with the raw emotion behind it. He advanced again, his eyes locked on Ethan's, daring him to say anything that would justify his fury. Ethan's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked amused, as if Christopher's anger was nothing more than an inconvenience, a small bump in the road of his control over the household. He raised his hands in mock defense, the smirk never leaving his face. "Relax, Chris," Ethan said, his voice low, smooth, and condescending. "You're overreacting. Alice is fine. You're the one making this into something it's not." Christopher's heart pounded in his chest. That tone, that dismissive attitude, made his blood boil. He had seen the fear in Alice's eyes, heard Ethan's threats with his own ears. This wasn't an overreaction. This was a father protecting his daughter from a monster. "You don't get to tell me how to feel about my daughter," Christopher growled, his voice lowering, but his intensity growing with every word. He took another step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "You've been terrorizing her. I've heard you. You threaten her, you manipulate her, and you think I'm just going to stand by and let it happen." Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time, just a flicker, but it was enough. For a brief moment, Christopher saw a crack in the mask Ethan always wore, the cool, calculating facade. But then, Ethan straightened up, his face hardening into something darker. "You've got it all wrong," Ethan said coldly, his voice turning more sinister. He stepped forward now, closing the space between them. "Alice is my stepdaughter. She lives under my roof now. You don't get to barge in here and make demands. If she's got problems, it's because you're not around enough to be a real father." Christopher's rage boiled over. His fist shot out before he could think, connecting with Ethan's jaw in a hard, swift motion. Ethan staggered back, momentarily stunned, clutching his face in shock. "Don't you dare talk to me about being a father!" Christopher roared, advancing again. "You don't know anything about protecting a child. All you know is how to control and threaten people smaller than you. Ethan recovered quickly, the shock on his face melting into fury. He wiped the corner of his mouth, glaring at Christopher with venom in his eyes. "You're gonna regret that," Ethan hissed, his voice low and menacing. He lunged forward, shoving Christopher hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back a step. "You think you can come into my house and throw punches? You think you can just take her away from me?" Christopher steadied himself, his pulse racing. His hands shook, not from fear but from the sheer force of his desire to end this, to get Alice out of here, away from Ethan's poisonous influence. "She's not yours," Christopher said, his voice steadier now, though still seething with anger. "She's my daughter, and I'm going to make sure she's never alone with you again. Is that so?" Ethan sneered, stepping forward again, his eyes dark with rage. "How do you plan on doing that, Chris? Running to the cops with no proof? You're the one who looks like a lunatic, barging in here throwing punches in front of your daughter. You think they'll side with you? Think again." The cruel logic in Ethan's words stung, but Christopher didn't back down. He knew Ethan was manipulating the situation, twisting the truth to make it seem like Christopher was the problem. But Christopher had something more powerful than Ethan's lies. He had seen Ethan for what he truly was, and more importantly, he had people on his side, Robert, Vanessa. They would help him get the proof he needed. Before either man could move again, a small, trembling voice broke the tense silence. "Dad, stop." Both men froze. Alice had stepped out from the corner where she had been huddled, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She stood in the middle of the room, looking between the two men, the father who had always protected her, and the man who had made her life a living nightmare. Christopher's heart broke at the sight of her, standing there, caught between them. He took a deep breath, trying to rein in his anger. He had promised himself he wouldn't make this worse for her, that he would be smart, careful. But seeing her so scared, so fragile, made it impossible for him to think clearly. "Alice," Christopher said softly, his voice shaking with the effort to stay calm. I'm sorry you had to see that. But you don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm not leaving you here with him." Ethan let out a sharp laugh, his eyes still locked on Christopher. "She's not going anywhere, Chris. Not unless you want to go to jail for trespassing and assault." Christopher turned to Ethan, his jaw clenched. He knew that legally, Ethan was right. If Christopher took Alice now, without solid proof, Ethan would call the police, and things would spiral out of control. He couldn't let that happen. Not yet. But then Alice spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Dad, don't leave me here." Those words hit Christopher harder than any threat Ethan could make. He looked into Alice's eyes and saw the fear, the desperation, the plea for help that she had been too afraid to say aloud until now. His hands shook, and his heart felt like it was being torn in two. He couldn't take her, not yet, but he also couldn't walk away and leave her behind. He needed to think, to figure out the best move, but the clock was ticking. "I'm not leaving you here," Christopher repeated, his voice steady but low, almost a promise to both Alice and himself. He turned to Ethan one last time, his eyes cold with determination. "You're gonna pay for what you've done. I'll make sure of it." With that, Christopher stepped back, his chest tight with the weight of the decision he had to make. He couldn't take Alice tonight, but the fight was far from over. He had to regroup, to build the case against Ethan, and ensure that when he did take her, it would be for good. As he turned to leave, the tension between him and Ethan crackled in the air, but neither spoke another word. Christopher left the house with his fists still clenched, his mind already racing with the next steps. He had to save his daughter, no matter what it took. Christopher had barely made it 2 steps toward the door when Ethan lunged at him from behind. The force of Ethan's body slamming into his back sent Christopher stumbling forward, his shoulders smashing into the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of him, but the sudden surge of adrenaline kept him on his feet. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with Ethan, whose expression had twisted into something dark, something dangerous. "You think you can just walk out of here like that, huh?" Ethan growled, his voice low and menacing as he advanced. "You think you can threaten me in my own house?" Christopher didn't respond. His heart raced, not from fear but from the overwhelming need to protect Alice, who was frozen in terror across the room, her wide eyes locked on the scene unfolding before her. Ethan swung first, his fist coming at Christopher's jaw with surprising speed. Christopher barely managed to duck in time, the punch grazing the side of his face. He recovered quickly, shoving Ethan hard in the chest, sending him crashing backward into a small table. The table toppled over, knocking a lamp to the floor with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the room, adding to the chaos. "You don't touch my daughter again," Christopher shouted, his voice filled with a fury that shook the walls. He stepped forward, ready to continue the fight, but Ethan scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "Your daughter?" Ethan spat, his voice dripping with venom. "She's not yours anymore. You're a joke, Christopher," a pathetic excuse for a father. Those words were like gasoline on an already raging fire. Christopher saw red. He charged at Ethan, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled, fists flying, legs kicking, knocking over furniture as they struggled for control. The room descended into chaos, chairs upturned, glass shattering, but Christopher didn't care about any of it. All that mattered was getting Ethan away from Alice. Ethan managed to throw a wild punch that landed squarely on Christopher's ribs, the pain sharp and immediate. Christopher gasped, but he didn't relent. He grabbed Ethan by the shirt, pulling him close, their faces inches apart. "You will never threaten Alice again," Christopher hissed through clenched teeth, his grip tightening as he pinned Ethan to the floor. Ethan's lips curled into a sickening grin, despite the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think you can protect her from me?" Ethan sneered, his voice filled with malice. "She's scared of you, Chris. You're the one making things worse." The words stung, but Christopher knew they were lies. He could see the truth in Alice's eyes every time she looked at him. She was terrified of Ethan, and he wasn't going to let her live in fear for another moment. Before Christopher could strike again, Ethan twisted his body, managing to free one arm. With a vicious shove, he pushed Christopher off, sending him sprawling onto the floor. Ethan scrambled to his feet, panting heavily, his eyes wild with anger. He lunged at Christopher again, but this time Christopher was ready. In one swift motion, Christopher rolled to the side, grabbing a chair leg that had broken off during the scuffle. As Ethan charged, Christopher swung the makeshift weapon with all his strength, striking Ethan square in the stomach. The force of the blow sent Ethan reeling backward, gasping for air as he doubled over in pain. "I'm done playing your games," Christopher growled, his voice low and dangerous as he rose to his feet, towering over Ethan. "You're finished." Ethan glared up at him, his eyes filled with hatred, but he didn't make another move. He was hurt, winded, but the fight hadn't left his spirit. He wiped the blood from his mouth, eyes still locked on Christopher. Across the room, Alice stood frozen, her hands clutched tightly to her chest, her small body trembling with fear. Seeing her like that, so small, so fragile, ignited a fresh wave of determination in Christopher. He had to end this now. Without taking his eyes off Ethan, Christopher reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He quickly dialed Robert's number, holding the phone to his ear as he kept one hand raised in warning, ready to strike if Ethan tried anything again. "Robert," Christopher gasped, his breath still ragged from the fight. "I need help, now. Ethan's threatening Alice." There was no hesitation on the other end. "We're on our way." Robert's voice came through the phone, sharp and focused. "Stay where you are. Don't let him leave. Vanessa's with me." Christopher ended the call, his eyes never leaving Ethan. His chest heaved with exertion, but he held his ground. He knew Robert and Vanessa would arrive soon, but until then, he had to keep Ethan contained, had to keep Alice safe. Ethan slowly pushed himself off the ground, standing unsteadily. His smug grin was gone now, replaced with something darker, more dangerous. He glanced at Alice, who flinched under his gaze, and then back at Christopher. "You think you're the hero here?" Ethan sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't know what you've just done. You're going to regret this, Chris." Christopher stepped forward, his body tense, ready for whatever Ethan might try next. "The only thing I regret," Christopher said coldly, his voice steady, "is not stopping you sooner." For a moment, it seemed like Ethan might lunge at him again, but then the sound of sirens filled the air outside. Ethan's expression flickered with surprise, then anger as he realized what was happening. Christopher didn't move, watching as Ethan's bravado began to crumble. "You're done, Ethan," Christopher said, his voice firm but low. "It's over." Ethan's face twisted in fury, but he said nothing. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. Christopher could feel Alice's eyes on him, could hear her small, shaky breaths as she tried to hold herself together. The sirens grew louder, closer, and then there was the sound of footsteps approaching the house. Robert and Vanessa were here. Help had arrived. Christopher let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He stepped back, glancing over at Alice. Her wide, tear-filled eyes met his, and in that moment, he saw everything. The fear, the confusion, the hope. She was terrified, but she was also looking at him like he was her only lifeline, her only chance at safety. "It's okay, Alice," Christopher said softly, his voice full of emotion. "You're safe now, I promise." Ethan sneered one last time, but his fight was over. As the door burst open and Robert and Vanessa entered, Ethan's shoulders slumped. Vanessa's sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation, and Robert moved swiftly, placing himself between Ethan and Alice. "You've got a lot to answer for, Ethan," Robert said, his voice cold as steel. Ethan didn't respond, his eyes filled with a quiet, simmering rage as he glared at Christopher. But he didn't resist. He knew it was over. Vanessa approached Alice slowly, her voice gentle as she knelt down to meet her at eye level. "Alice, sweetie, it's okay now," Vanessa said softly, offering a comforting smile. "You're safe. We're here to help." Alice's lip quivered, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, she let out a small sob. Christopher's heart broke all over again as he watched her crumble, the weight of everything she'd been holding and finally breaking through. Christopher stepped forward, kneeling down beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now, Alice. I won't let him hurt you again." For the first time in what felt like forever, Alice clung to him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck as she buried her face in his chest. She trembled against him, her tears soaking his shirt, but Christopher didn't care. He held her tighter, his own tears threatening to spill as relief washed over him. It was over. Ethan's hold on Alice was broken. But even as they stood there, surrounded by Robert and Vanessa, Christopher knew the fight wasn't truly finished. There would be battles ahead, legal ones, emotional ones. But for now, he had his daughter in his arms, safe from the monster who had tried to break her. And that was all that mattered. Christopher barely registered the world around him as he rushed to Alice's side. His heart pounded in his chest, his body still buzzing with the adrenaline from the fight. He reached her, pulling her trembling frame into his arms, her small body rigid with fear. She didn't resist, didn't make a sound, but clung to him as if he was the only thing keeping her safe. And he was. He knew he couldn't leave her in that house for even one more second. "Come on, sweetheart," Christopher whispered into Alice's ear, his voice shaking with the intensity of the moment. "We're leaving, right now." Alice didn't speak, but the way her tiny fingers dug into his shirt told him everything he needed to know. She was terrified of Ethan, of what might happen next, of the fact that her world had just erupted in violence. But she trusted Christopher. In her eyes, he was her only protector, the only one who could pull her out of this nightmare. Christopher glanced over his shoulder, seeing Ethan still sprawled on the floor, gasping for breath. Ethan's face was contorted in a mixture of pain and hatred, his hands gripping the edge of the couch as he struggled to pull himself up. His eyes locked onto Christopher and Alice, blazing with fury. "You think you can just take her?" Ethan rasped, his voice thick with venom, still trying to catch his breath. "You're gonna regret this, Christopher. You're gonna regret everything." Christopher didn't respond. He had no interest in Ethan's threats. His only focus was on Alice, on getting her out of this toxic, dangerous place. He stood up, still holding Alice tightly in his arms, and turned his back on Ethan, making his way toward the door. "You'll never win, Chris." Ethan spat, his voice rising in anger as Christopher moved further away. "You think this is over? It's not. You'll never take her from me." The venom in Ethan's voice echoed in Christopher's mind, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. He couldn't allow himself to get drawn into another confrontation. Not with Alice so fragile, so terrified in his arms. He had to get her away. Now. As he reached the front door, Christopher kicked it open with his foot, not caring about the damage. The cool air hit his face as he stepped outside, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. He moved quickly, holding Alice close, shielding her from the house, from Ethan's voice that still echoed in the background. He rushed to his car, opening the back door with one hand, carefully placing Alice inside. Her eyes were wide, her breath shaky, but she didn't protest. She simply stared at him, as if trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. "I'm here, Alice," Christopher said softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face as he knelt beside her. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For a moment, Alice's lip trembled, and Christopher's heart broke all over again. He wanted to stay there, to hold her and tell her that everything was going to be okay. But they weren't safe yet. Not until they were far away from that house, far away from Ethan. Christopher closed the door gently, making sure Alice was secure before hurrying around to the driver's seat. As he slid into the car, he glanced back toward the house. Through the window, he could see Ethan, finally standing upright, his face twisted with rage as he stared at them from inside. "This isn't over, Chris!" Ethan's muffled voice shouted from behind the glass. "You're making a mistake!" Ignoring the furious figure in the window, Christopher started the car, the engine roaring to life. He didn't waste any more time. With one final glance at the house, the place that had caused so much pain for his daughter, he put the car in gear and sped away. The silence in the car was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This wasn't the suffocating, fearful quiet that had filled the air when they were still under Ethan's roof. This was the silence of escape, of relief, of survival. Christopher's hands tightened on the steering wheel as they sped down the road. He didn't know where they were going yet, but anywhere was better than where they had been. His mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened, the image of Ethan's sneering face still fresh in his memory. But all of that was secondary now. The most important thing was that Alice was with him. She was safe for now. After several minutes of driving, Christopher glanced in the rearview mirror. Alice sat in the back seat, curled up in the corner, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the window, staring out as the world blurred by, but her expression was distant, as if she was far away, lost in her thoughts. Christopher wanted to say something, to reassure her, but he knew there were no words that could erase what she had been through. He couldn't just tell her everything would be okay, not after what she had endured. All he could do was be there for her, to show her that he wasn't going to leave her alone in this. "Alice," Christopher said gently, glancing at her through the mirror again. "Are you okay back there?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes stayed locked on the window, her face still blank, still processing. But then, slowly, she nodded. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm okay." But Christopher knew she wasn't. How could she be? She had been living in fear, under the constant threat of a man who was supposed to be part of her family. She had been forced to keep silent, to endure Ethan's cruelty, and now, even though she was free, the trauma lingered. He could see it in the way her small frame trembled, in the way she couldn't quite meet his eyes. "I'm not going to let him hurt you again," Christopher promised, his voice firm with conviction. "You're safe with me, Alice. We're going to figure this out, I swear." For the first time, Alice looked up, her wide eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. There was a glimmer of something there, hope, maybe, but it was faint, buried beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. Christopher turned his eyes back to the road, his mind already working through what needed to happen next. He needed to get in touch with Robert and Vanessa. They had to make sure Ethan couldn't come after them, couldn't manipulate the situation or use the legal system to bring Alice back into that toxic environment. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing Robert's number while keeping one hand on the wheel. Robert picked up almost immediately. "Chris?" Robert's voice came through, tense but focused. "What's going on? Did you get Alice out?" "Yeah," Christopher replied, glancing back at Alice again. "She's with me. We're safe for now, but we need to act fast. Ethan's losing it. He's not going to let this go. Good, Robert said, his voice hard. Get to a safe place. Vanessa and I will meet you there. We need to lock this down before Ethan tries anything. Christopher nodded, even though Robert couldn't see him. He ended the call and focused on the road ahead. They weren't far from a small motel he had seen earlier. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for the night, just until they could figure out the next step. As they drove, Alice stayed quiet, her eyes distant once again. But Christopher knew she was processing everything, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had been through so much, but she was strong. He could see that strength in her, even in her silence. He reached out a hand to the back seat, not looking, but offering his palm in comfort. After a few moments, he felt Alice's small hand slip into his. It was a quiet gesture, but it spoke volumes. She was still scared, still shaken, but she trusted him. She was holding on. "I've got you, Alice," Christopher whispered, more to himself than to her. "I've got you." As they pulled into the motel parking lot, the weight of everything that had happened settled on Christopher's shoulders. The fight was far from over. Ethan wouldn't give up easily, and there were still legal battles ahead. But for tonight, Alice was safe. And for now, that was enough. Christopher sat in the small motel room, his leg bouncing anxiously as he waited for Robert and Vanessa to arrive. Alice had finally fallen asleep on the bed, curled up in a tight ball with her arms wrapped around a pillow. Her breathing was steady, but her face was still pale, her body still trembling slightly even in her sleep. He watched her, his heart aching. She looked so fragile, so small. It killed him that it had come to this, having to pull her out of the house in such a violent, chaotic way. But he had no choice. He had to protect her, no matter what. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Robert. "We're here." Robert's voice came through the phone, short and direct. "We'll be up in a minute." Christopher glanced at the door and then back at Alice. He didn't want to wake her, not yet. She needed rest, a break from the nightmare she had been living. He stood quietly, moving to the door and opening it, just as Robert and Vanessa walked down the hall toward him. "Chris," Robert greeted him with a firm nod, stepping inside. Vanessa followed closely, her face set in a determined expression. The air between them was thick with urgency, the weight of what had happened pressing down on all of them. Vanessa didn't waste any time. As soon as she entered the room, she scanned the area, her eyes landing on Alice's sleeping form. Her face softened for a brief moment, but then her professional demeanor returned. "Tell me everything," Vanessa said quietly but firmly, turning to Christopher. Christopher's jaw tightened as he recounted the events of the evening, the confrontation with Ethan, the threats, the violence. His voice was low, but the anger simmering beneath every word was clear. He described Ethan's manipulation, how he'd used fear to control Alice, how she had been too scared to speak for herself until it was nearly too late. Vanessa listened intently, her expression serious as she absorbed every detail. When Christopher finished, there was a long pause as she considered the next steps. "This is worse than I expected," Vanessa said, her voice steady but filled with an edge of tension. "Ethan's not just emotionally abusive, he's dangerous. We can't let Alice go back there, not even for a second." Christopher nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was the right call, but hearing it from Vanessa, someone who understood the system, made it feel real. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had hope. "What do we do next?" Christopher asked, his voice quiet but laced with urgency. "Ethan's not going to let this go easily. He'll come after her, and he'll twist the system to try and get her back. I can't let that happen." Vanessa sighed, crossing her arms and pacing slightly as she thought through the situation. "We have enough to start immediate legal proceedings," she said finally, her eyes sharp as they met Christopher's. "But we need more concrete evidence to ensure the court sides with us permanently. Emotional abuse is hard to prove unless we have witnesses or records of his threats. But what you described, his manipulation of Alice, the way he's used fear to control her, that's enough to file an emergency protective order for now." Robert, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward. "Vanessa's right. We have to act quickly. Ethan's already made threats, and if he realizes we're moving against him, he might escalate. He's smart, Chris, but we're not going to let him get away with this. Christopher's mind raced as he processed their words. He knew Ethan would fight back, and fight dirty, but for the first time he felt like he wasn't alone in this battle. Vanessa and Robert had a plan, and they weren't going to back down. "I can't risk him hurting Alice again," Christopher said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it. I just need to know she's safe." Vanessa nodded, her face serious but reassuring. "She's safe with you right now," Vanessa said. "But we need to make sure the law is on our side before we make any more moves. I'll start filing the paperwork for the protective order tonight. We'll submit the evidence we have, your account of the threats, the fight, everything. It's enough to keep Alice out of his reach for now." Christopher felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly followed by a surge of anxiety. This was just the beginning. The legal process could be slow, and Ethan wasn't going to sit back and let it happen without a fight. "And what about Susan?" Christopher asked, his brow furrowing. "She's been blind to everything. I don't know how she'll react when she finds out what's happening." Vanessa paused for a moment, clearly weighing her words. "We'll have to approach Susan carefully," she said finally. "She's been manipulated by Ethan just like Alice has, but in a different way. If we can show her the truth, if we can prove to her what Ethan's really like, she might come around. But if she doesn't..." Her voice trailed off, and Christopher finished the thought for her. "If she doesn't, she'll fight me too," Vanessa nodded grimly. "It's possible, but that's a risk we have to be prepared for. If Susan sides with Ethan, it'll complicate things, but it won't stop us. We have the law on our side now." Christopher ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He looked over at Alice, still sleeping soundly despite everything, and his resolve hardened. No matter what, he had to protect her. "Do whatever you need to do," he said firmly. "File the order, get the evidence. I don't care what it takes. I won't let her go back there." Vanessa nodded, already pulling out her phone and typing a message to her contacts at the courthouse. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had done this 100 times before, but Christopher could tell she was taking this case personally. She understood the stakes. She knew what Alice had been through. As Vanessa made her calls, Robert stepped closer to Christopher, his voice low but filled with reassurance. "You did the right thing, Chris. Getting her out of there. Don't doubt yourself. Ethan's the type who thrives on making people question themselves, but you didn't fall for it. You fought for Alice, and you're going to keep fighting." Christopher nodded, his throat tight. He appreciated Robert's words, but the guilt still gnawed at him. He had waited too long, let Ethan get too deep into Alice's life. He should have seen it sooner. Should have stopped it before it escalated to this point. "I should have done this earlier," Christopher muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have protected her better." Robert placed a firm hand on Christopher's shoulder, his grip strong. "You're protecting her now," Robert said, "and that's what matters." Christopher swallowed hard, nodding again, though the weight of the past still lingered. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could control what happened next. He could make sure Ethan never had the chance to hurt Alice again. Vanessa finished her call and turned back to them, her expression serious but with a glint of determination in her eyes. "It's in motion," she said. "We'll have the protective order by morning. Until then, stay here. Don't go anywhere. If Ethan tries anything, call me immediately. We're not giving him an inch." Christopher nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and tension settling over him. The legal process had begun, and for now, Alice was safe. But he knew this wasn't the end. Ethan would fight back. He would manipulate, lie, and twist the truth to try and regain control. But Christopher wasn't going to let him win. He looked at Alice again, still sleeping, and felt his heart swell with a fierce protectiveness. "I'll never let him hurt her again," Christopher said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Vanessa and Robert exchanged a glance, both understanding the weight of his words. They had seen this kind of battle before, one that wasn't just fought in courtrooms but in the hearts and minds of families torn apart by manipulation and fear. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "We're going to make sure she never has to go back to that house. We're going to make sure Ethan can't touch her again." Christopher nodded, his heart heavy, but his resolve firm. The fight had only just begun, but with Vanessa and Robert by his side, he knew they had a chance. A chance to break Ethan's hold on Alice, a chance to rebuild the life she deserved. And that chance was all Christopher needed to keep going. Days passed in a tense blur, each one filled with anxious waiting as Vanessa and Robert dug deeper into Ethan's life. Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that every hour that ticked by was a chance for Ethan to manipulate the situation further. But Vanessa was relentless, using her connections within the police force and legal system to piece together the dark truth that Ethan had been hiding. Christopher had kept Alice close during this time, never letting her out of his sight. The emotional toll on her was clear. She was quieter than ever, barely speaking, her eyes always clouded with a fear that seemed to grip her constantly. He hated seeing her like this, a shadow of the bright, lively girl she used to be. He knew it would take time for her to heal, but he also knew that the first step in that healing process was making sure Ethan was permanently removed from their lives. One evening, just as Christopher was about to call Vanessa for an update, his phone rang. It was her. He answered immediately, his heart racing. "Vanessa, what's happening? Did you find anything?" Christopher's voice was thick with anticipation, his nerves on edge. "I found more than we expected." Vanessa's voice came through the line, calm but carrying a weight that made Christopher's heart skip a beat. "We've been digging into Ethan's background, his finances, everything, and we've confirmed that he's been hiding a lot more than we thought." Christopher gripped the phone tighter, pacing the length of the small motel room. Alice was sitting on the bed, drawing quietly, but even in her own world, she seemed to sense his tension. She glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a question she didn't dare ask. "What did you find?" Christopher asked, his voice low, his body taut with expectation. Vanessa took a deep breath before she continued. "First of all, Ethan's been cheating on Susan for months. We have proof, photos, text messages, everything. He's been meeting with another woman, someone outside of their circle. But that's not all. We also uncovered a series of threats Ethan made to Alice, not just verbal, but through texts and recorded conversations we didn't even know existed. Alice was too scared to tell anyone, but she recorded him on her phone. She must have hidden it to protect herself. The threats are clear, Chris. He was using his affair to manipulate and scare her into silence." Christopher's blood ran cold. His mind flashed back to that night when he'd watched Ethan tower over Alice, spitting threats with venom in his voice. The realization that Alice had been silently enduring Ethan's cruelty, recording it to protect herself, tore at him. She had been living in constant fear, unable to speak out, and he hadn't known how deep it went. "He threatened her with his affair?" Christopher asked, his voice barely steady as the rage built inside him. "Yes," Vanessa confirmed, her tone grim. "He made her believe that if she told Susan anything, it would destroy their family, that it would all be her fault. That's how he kept her quiet. But now that we have these recordings, we can move forward. Ethan has no way to explain this away. It's over for him." Christopher took a deep breath, feeling the fury inside him swirl with relief. They finally had the evidence they needed, and it was undeniable. Ethan had been caught, and there was no escaping the consequences now. But there was one more question burning in Christopher's mind. "What about Susan?" he asked, his voice softening as he glanced over at Alice. "She still doesn't know, does she?" Vanessa hesitated for a moment before answering. "No, she doesn't. But we can't keep her in the dark any longer. We have to tell her the truth. She needs to understand what Ethan's been doing, not just to Alice, but to her. Susan's been manipulated too, and this will hit her hard. But it's the only way to get her on board with removing Ethan for good." Christopher nodded to himself, knowing that Vanessa was right. As much as he resented Susan for being blind to Ethan's abuse, she had been played too. She deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered her world. But he dreaded the conversation. He didn't know how she would react, whether she would accept the truth or fall deeper into Ethan's web of lies. He knew how good Ethan was at manipulating people, at twisting reality to suit his needs. "When are we telling her?" Christopher asked, already bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. "Tonight," Vanessa replied. I've already spoken to Robert. He'll be there with us. Susan needs to hear everything from someone she trusts, and I think you should be there too, Chris. She needs to know that this is about protecting Alice, not just about her marriage." Christopher exhaled deeply, the weight of the upcoming conversation pressing down on him. But he agreed. It had to happen. For Alice's sake, for her future, they had to make sure Susan understood what Ethan had done. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll be there." Later that evening, Christopher pulled up outside Susan's house. His stomach churned as he stared at the familiar facade, memories of the last time he was here flashing through his mind. The fight with Ethan, the threats, the look of terror in Alice's eyes. Tonight would be different. Tonight they were bringing the truth into the open, and nothing would be the same after that. Robert and Vanessa were already there, standing by the front door, waiting for him. As he approached, Robert gave him a nod, the kind of nod that said, "We're in this together." "Are you ready?" Vanessa asked, her voice low but steady. Christopher glanced at the door, knowing what was waiting on the other side. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his jaw tight with determination. Together, the three of them walked up to the door and knocked. A few moments later, Susan opened it, her face lined with confusion and tension. She hadn't expected this, a late-night visit from her ex-husband, accompanied by a detective and an old family friend. "What's going on?" Susan asked, her eyes darting between them. "Why are you all here?" Christopher stepped forward, his heart pounding. He knew this conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. "Susan," he began, his voice soft but firm, "there's something you need to know about Ethan." Susan frowned, her arms crossing defensively. She opened the door wider, allowing them inside, but her posture was stiff, as if bracing herself for bad news. Once they were seated in the living room, Vanessa took the lead, her voice calm but filled with the gravity of the situation. "Susan, we've been investigating Ethan for the past few days," Vanessa began, "and we've uncovered some things that you need to know. This is going to be hard to hear, but you need to hear it." Susan's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into her features. "What kind of things?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion and growing unease. Vanessa exchanged a brief glance with Christopher before continuing. Christopher sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding as the judge shuffled through the last of the paperwork. The silence in the room was thick with tension, every breath measured, every movement cautious. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Months of fear, fights, and endless legal battles had led to this single decision. His eyes flicked to Alice, who sat beside him, her small hand resting on his arm. She looked so much smaller in this room, her face pale but composed, her eyes filled with a quiet determination that had grown in her since they had escaped from Ethan's grip. On the other side of the courtroom sat Ethan, his face hardened with resentment, but Christopher noticed the subtle defeat in his eyes. It had taken everything Ethan had to keep up the charade, to twist the system in his favor, but today was different. Today, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and not even his manipulative charm could change that. Susan, too, sat on the opposite side, her face drawn and exhausted. The truth of Ethan's betrayal had hit her hard, and while she had been resistant at first, the undeniable evidence, Vanessa's investigation, the recordings, the threats to Alice, had shattered the illusion she had been living in. She didn't speak to Ethan anymore, and though her relationship with Christopher had been rocky during the divorce, they had begun to rebuild some semblance of trust for the sake of Alice. The judge finally cleared his throat, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. After reviewing all the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice measured and deliberate. "And considering the welfare of the child, the court rules in favor of Mr. Christopher Bennett. Full custody of Alice Bennett is hereby granted to her father. Furthermore, a restraining order will be placed against Mr. Ethan Mills, preventing any contact with the child or Mr. Bennett until further notice." Christopher closed his eyes for a moment, relief flooding through him. It was over. After everything, every sleepless night, every tear Alice had shed, every moment of doubt and fear, it was finally over. He turned to Alice, his heart swelling as he saw the tiny smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Alice looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with a sense of security that had been absent for so long. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Christopher felt her relax. The tension that had coiled in her small body for months seemed to melt away, replaced by something fragile but precious: hope. As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the world as a newly defined family, Christopher felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had won. He had protected his daughter. And now, the most important chapter of their lives could begin, the one where Alice was safe, free from the shadows that had haunted her. The first few weeks after the court's decision were delicate. Alice still had nightmares, echoes of Ethan's threats that lingered in her mind. There were days when she barely spoke, days when she seemed distant, lost in memories she couldn't shake. Christopher had expected that. Healing wasn't going to happen overnight. He knew this would be a long journey, one they would take together, step by step. But there were moments of light, small, fragile signs that Alice was beginning to feel safe again. One morning, Christopher woke to the sound of soft laughter drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. It had been so long since he'd heard Alice laugh that the sound almost startled him. He walked quietly toward the kitchen, and there she was, sitting at the table, playing with her cereal, a shy smile on her face as she watched a silly cartoon on the TV. Christopher leaned against the doorway, watching her, his heart swelling with a mix of joy and relief. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live again. "Good morning, kiddo," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Alice looked up, her eyes brightening when she saw him. That smile, the one that had been missing for so long, spread across her face, and for a moment, Christopher felt like he could breathe again. "Morning, Dad," she replied, her voice still soft but without the weight of fear that had clung to her for so long. He walked over to the table, ruffling her hair playfully as he sat down across from her. Alice giggled, the sound like music to his ears. "What's so funny this morning?" he asked, glancing at the cartoon on the screen. Alice shrugged, still smiling. "Just stuff." Christopher chuckled, amazed at how something so simple, so normal, could feel like the greatest victory. He would never take this for granted again. Every smile, every laugh, every moment of peace was a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The nightmares became less frequent as the months passed, and Alice's confidence grew. She started to rediscover herself, finding joy in the small things again, like drawing, playing outside, and talking about her day. Christopher enrolled her in art classes, something she had always loved but had lost interest in during the darker days. The first time she came home with a drawing, her face glowing with pride, Christopher had to fight back tears. "Look, Dad," she had said, holding up a picture she had drawn of a tree with bright flowers blooming all around it. "I made this today." Christopher took the drawing from her, examining it carefully. The colors were vibrant, full of life, just like Alice was starting to become again. "It's beautiful, Alice," he said, smiling at her. "You've got real talent, you know that?" She beamed at him, her cheeks flushing with happiness. "My teacher said I should enter it in the school art show," she added shyly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. "Do you think I should?" Christopher's heart swelled with pride. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Absolutely," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You should be proud of what you've made." Alice nodded, and for a moment she stood a little taller. It was in these small moments, the ones where she started to believe in herself again, that Christopher saw just how resilient his daughter truly was. She had faced so much darkness, so much fear, but she was emerging from it, bit by bit, stronger and braver than he could have ever imagined. There were still challenges ahead. Christopher knew that. Ethan's presence in their lives wasn't something that would disappear completely, not yet. But the restraining order ensured that he couldn't come near them. And with Vanessa and Robert's support, Christopher was prepared for any future battles that might arise. But for now, things were peaceful. Alice was healing, and Christopher was finding his footing as a single father. It wasn't always easy, but the bond they shared had grown stronger through the storm they had weathered together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alice turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Dad?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, sweetheart?" Alice paused for a moment, her eyes reflecting the warm colors of the sky. "Do you think everything's going to be okay now?" Christopher looked at her, his heart swelling with love for this brave little girl who had been through so much. He nodded, his voice soft but full of certainty. "Yeah, Alice, I really do." She smiled at him, a genuine, unguarded smile, and Christopher knew that while the road ahead might still have its challenges, they would face them together. Alice was safe, she was happy, and she was free from the darkness that had once threatened to consume her. And for Christopher, that was the greatest victory of all.